You gotta get into Planet Fitness, dude. I'm still so sore from Sunday.
It's an art and craft.
And it's
I get sore from my workouts at home.
But I'm telling you, it's like a different giveaway. At least for me, I don't know.
Over here they were doing Ayers Rock or whatever it is out in Alice Springs. I know there's a second
Yeah, I need you to tell me whether it's going to go
Yeah.
Yeah, I have to show you the video. I have to show you the video from last week. It's like up to your waist, the entire time. I'm like, why are there only 4 people?
Sure, that's good.
All right, welcome everyone who's here and who is here virtually. We're going to start momentarily, but if you do want to follow along the text of today's class, you can find it is in the Talmud tractate Bava Basra or Bava Basra. You can find it on Sefaria.org, or if you have the Sefaria app. We are on 73B. 73B1. In the art scroll, or towards the top of the page of 73B.
Anybody want to look?
Yeah.
So, won't do anything.
Yeah, it's an hour time. I completely empty ties.
Unless you're on it.
Huh?
Unless you're on it.
No, I am.
Oh, like tomorrow will sound a lot better.
Wait, which page?
73B?
73B1, the very last line of 73B1.
Oh.
No? Okay. We are going to continue now along the topic for the last 2 weeks. We'll ride this out as long as we can. And we'll see if there is an interest in switching it back up to the more conventional, typical Gemara. We can. In the meantime, it's been going well, I think. So we'll continue as what we've been talking about. One of the strangest sections in the Talmud, which talks about, it's pretty much the way we've approached it, and I think most of the commentaries understand this Talmud to be entirely metaphoric. So it's known as the 21 journeys of Rabbah Bar Bar Chanah. His 21, some of them are journeys, some of them are stories that he shares, but it's, as we said, it's like right out of a science fiction, Dr. Seuss, totally bizarre stories. And I mean, the fact that there are bizarre stories, listen, Judaism has always had Bava mices. We know that. That's a part of our tradition, is that we have, we make up stories. But that's not what's remarkable. What's remarkable is that it's in the Talmud. The Talmud is our most essential book of Jewish wisdom. In fact, it's called Talmud. What does Talmud mean? Talmud means study. So this is, and in yeshivas they spend 8 to 10 hours a day studying Talmud. So this is the essence of our wisdom. And to include strange tales in our book of Talmud, it's got to be that there's something deep to it. And as we've gone through so far 4 stories, and elaborated on the deeper significance behind each of them. And there are different commentaries. So what we've generally done is explained each episode from 2 different perspectives. And they could be the 2 different perspectives could be totally different from one another. And as you're going to see today, that is the same. And with that, let's jump into what is now the 5th story in the series of stories of Rabbah Bar Bar Chanah. And so again, it's the 5th story, tractate Bava Basra, 73b, the top of the page. Ve'amar Rabbah Bar Bar Chanah. We just concluded a story about a young, wild buffalo which was 1 day old and yet was trying to go to battle, and we explained that, elaborated on that last week, to be about a person who studies Torah, and at a young point, a young age, or earlier in their study of Torah, they make the mistake of assuming that they are already, because they figure things out quickly, that they are advanced enough that they can challenge even the seasoned Torah scholar. That's what was the last story. Hopefully you remember that. The way we've been doing this is that we'll say the story, and then I'll open it up for your interpretation, and then we'll give the Talmudic interpretation. So here's the strange fictional tale, with metaphoric value. Amar Rabbah Bar Bar Chanah said, "Lididi chazyali hahu akrukta." I think I even shared the beginning of the story last time without the elaboration. I saw a certain frog. Hahu akrukta. I saw a frog. Dahavya ki akra de Hagrunya. That was the size of a city of Accra in Hagrunya. So the frog was the size of a city. And the Gemara says, "V'Akra de Hagrunya kama havya." How big is Accra of Hagrunya? Shitin bati, the size of 60 houses. Asa tanina, a sea monster came, bal'a, and swallowed this giant frog. Asa pushkansa, a female raven came, ubala letanina, and swallowed the sea monster. Visalik yasid be'ilana, and was sitting in the tree. Tachazi kama chafesh chele d'ilana. Could you imagine how strong such a tree was? That it was able to hold the raven, which ate the sea monster, which ate the frog, which was the size of a city. The Gemara says. Rabbah Bar Shmuel concludes and says, "Ilavi hasam la amin." I would never believe it had I not been there. That's the story. Giant frog. I remember as a child always hearing there was an old lady who swallowed a spider. Ever heard that one?
Yeah.
Yes.
That's from Jews. Isn't it in the Haggadah? Where it's really
So it's similar, right? And this the Chad Gadya, the one goat.
Yeah.
So each one of these stories, like the Chad Gadya and the Haggadah, has deep. The Chad Gadya has deep mystical ideas to it. What could be the interpretation of the giant frog, which is swallowed by the sea monster, which is swallowed by the raven, which flies onto a tree and is supported by the tree? Anyone want to venture a guess as to what the metaphor, what the lesson in this is meant to be? Any thoughts on that?
Definitely abstract, right?
Yeah, all these are abstract. These stories are not meant to be, there's no tourist destination where you can go and see this event unfold. Although that would be a great moneymaker, I suppose. But, that's the tree the Talmud is talking about. That you could probably point to a tree and kind of convince people. Okay. I actually don't want to spend too much time on this because I actually like the next two metaphors more than this one. Of the three, I figured maybe we'll get to three because the last 2 weeks I prepared 3 or 4 and we only got to 2. So this week I'll aim for 3. But the next two I like more than this one. But I'll share the 2 different explanations that the commentaries give on this story. First is brought down by the Vilna Gaon, and he actually, you see, he has a certain consistency in how he translates all of these stories. He understands these stories with having to do with Torah scholars and the challenges that a Torah scholar faces. So over here he says the Torah scholars we find are compared to frogs. Why is a Torah scholar compared to a frog? Says the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, the great genius of Vilna. He says, just like frogs are never silent, they're constantly making noise. Torah scholars, when they study, are constantly making noise. If you walk into a yeshiva, it's interesting how different a yeshiva is to a library. Both are considered to be places of study. You go into a library and it's perfectly quiet. You make noise and people look at you strange. You can't make noise. This is a place we're all trying to study. You go into yeshiva hall. The worst thing for a yeshiva hall is when it's quiet. That means no one's learning. The yeshiva hall, the only way you know that it's energetic and there's a lot of Torah study going is you walk in and you can't hear yourself think because everyone's learning. And it's very fascinating how you're able to kind of in a yeshiva, I guess once you get used to it, what happens is you become, not only you become comfortable with the sound, it's almost like you need the sound. Like you need the noise in order to study. As soon as you walk into yeshiva, or and there's learning all around you, and there's noise, that gets you into the mode of it, and then you become one of the noisemakers. So this is that's why the sages, according to Gra, are compared to frogs, and therefore the giant frog represents Torah scholar. I'm not going to get into the exact size. All of the parts of the details of the story have an explanation, but let's just say that there is the frog represents the Torah scholar. However, there is a sea monster which threatens or actually swallows the frog, which means, what is the greatest threat for someone who has dedicated themselves to Torah study? I mean, it's hard to say what is the greatest threat. What is the threat to Torah study is someone who says, I can't study Torah, I've got to go earn a living. I can't study Torah, I've got to go make money. I've got to go build myself a home, a house, a job, a car, whatever it is that I need, so I don't have time for Torah study. So in this metaphor, according to the Vilna Gaon, that sea monster is the pursuit of worldly needs that threatens the young Torah scholar who wants to study Torah. And this is a struggle, which this is a struggle till today, where young men who are, when they get to that point in life where they could study Torah, or they could go get a job, or they could pursue a job, pursue a career, it's very difficult to maintain a commitment to Torah when you also have to pursue wealth and a livelihood, etc. So the sea monster, according to the Vilna Gaon, is that pursuit of livelihood which swallows the frog, swallows the sincere Torah scholar, and moves them away from Torah study. How does the scholar get back on track? So here you have the female raven which swallows the sea monster. Obviously, it doesn't make sense in any way, in a practical way, in a literal way. But a female raven, what is the metaphoric value of a female raven? So the Talmud says that most birds take care of their young. Most birds provide food for their young. The exception to that is the raven. The raven does not take care of its young, and at a very young age, the raven has to go and, so to say, rely on God for sustenance. Most of the animals, their mother tends to them for a long time and provides food. The raven does not, and therefore already at a very young age, the raven is dependent on God. So the response, the yeshiva student, the diligent scholar, who was involved in Torah study and suddenly got swallowed up by the needs of the world. The world says, go get a job, go earn a livelihood, all those things you have to run on. So and he's swallowed up by that. What brings that bird, so to say, back, what brings the frog back to its Torah study is the reminder of the raven, which is the one bird which is dependent on God. So the person who has bitachon and says, even though I know at some point I'm going to have to earn a livelihood, but I can trust in God, just like the raven trusts in God, that's the raven which swallows the frog. There's the famous Jewish joke about a young woman who gets engaged to a young man who's a yeshiva student. And the future father-in-law, this girl's father, wants to have a private conversation, a one-on-one talk with his future son-in-law. So they start talking, and he says to his future son-in-law, he says, so, you're going to marry my daughter, she loves you, that's wonderful, you love her, that's wonderful, but you're going to get married, and how are you going to survive? So he says, God will provide. Very nice. He continues, he says, well, that's very nice. He says, then, you're going to, God willing, you plan on having the children, of course. You're going to have to take care of your children, and that's a whole new expense. What are you going to do then? He looks and says, God will provide. He says, and then the family's going to grow, soon you have to deal with tuition costs, and there's just endless things which are going to come up. Do you have a plan in place? And he looks and he says, God will provide. So finally, the conversation ends, and the father-in-law goes to his wife, and she says, so, what do you think of our future son-in-law? He says, I have mixed feelings. He seems to be a very responsible person, but at least he thinks I'm God. So, I'm not sure if this fits into the metaphor of the story, but the idea is that the three steps actually make sense. The step is of Torah study, distraction from Torah study which could be overwhelming distraction in order to that I have to go earn a living. I have no time for Torah study. And really today, any time where I have the option of opening a holy book, I could say, well, right now I could also go online and maybe make a sale or buy something or whatever, take care of my life. That's the swallowing of the Torah scholar. And the response to that is a sense of trusting God. Yes, you got to work. And yes, you got to earn a living. On the other hand, a person shouldn't overwork. A person should recognize you work enough to be responsible, and then you rely on God that will be enough to support yourself and allow you to study Torah further. And that is also the idea of the tree. We find this idea that Torah is compared to a tree, and that's what it means. If a person puts their trust in God like the bird does, God will provide the tree which can carry even the greatest burden of weight. That was his way of saying, even the greatest burden of weight will be provided by the tree which God will provide to support this out. And I actually see this. I see this idea firsthand. If you're to, I know this could be somewhat of a, I wouldn't say controversial topic, but if you were to tell an American, the average American, what is a responsible way of living? They'll tell you the responsible way of living is you get a job, you make sure you have that, then you think about getting married maybe if you have a job and a home, and then you'll have a child or two, which is nice, and then that's it. If you were to suggest to such a person the idea of what exists in the ultra-Orthodox world, where families have 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 children, they'll look at you and say, it's crazy. It's impossible to do that. It's completely irresponsible. It's reckless. And you can't live that way. And yet, I can say from what I've seen, in the circles that I grew up in which that was common, in which having that type of family was commonplace, and yet people found a way. These families found a way. They had 9, 10 children. They sent them all to private school, which required tuition and everything, and yet they were okay. And yet these children grew up. They were fed. They weren't going hungry. They weren't going without clothing. Sometimes we allow our calculations of how much wealth you need to survive to overtake us entirely, and therefore we really don't allow ourselves to live as we properly should, with faith in God and trusting God. If a person trusts in God, you'll see that you can actually accomplish a lot more with a lot less investment of time and effort than you actually need to. So I think this story has very practical ramifications today, and the lesson is one which I think remains extremely relevant. I don't want to go into great length into this alternative explanation of this story, but I'll just share the basic idea.
I
Yeah.
have a quick question for you. So you're talking about some of these people say about 6, 7 kids. Do you pose it as a problem when some of these frum families reproduce, but they can't afford their kids and have to go on welfare?
Yeah. So therefore,
Because
it's true.
I mean that's a huge.
No, that's a very valid observation, and I imagine that maybe that's something that others are thinking. I'm glad you're saying it. So yes, a person is not. We have this. It's interesting. The same Torah and sages which encourage families and large families. There's a interesting halacha, which is that during the time of Batsoros, which means when there's a famine, when there's an extended famine, then it becomes prohibited to build a family. It is prohibited to have children at the time. Why? Because then it's a burden on society in a way that society can't manage. So the same sages, the same Torah, which encourages a family with children, also says there should be a level of responsibility. So therefore, yes, there is a line that can be crossed, in which case it is considered to be inappropriate. But I think what we see today in the world is the other extreme, where people are too cautious. In other words, they're from a sense of responsibility, there's a fear of any risk-taking or faith in God. The point is, there's very little faith in God in the process of how I'm going to survive. That how I'm going to survive has to be very calculated according to my efforts and what I can do on my own. I'm carrying the weight entirely on my own. And over here we say there's a tree. If you allow yourself, there's a strong tree. That's the metaphor over here. So yeah, you have to know when that line is crossed. But what I'm describing, what I've seen, is not families who have been living on welfare. I'm just saying, again, this is just my personal subjective view.
Yeah.
But what I'm describing is not talking about families. These are people who work, they earn a living. They don't spend on fancy cars. They don't spend on on big fancy vacations. They don't need, so there's many of the, perhaps they don't belong to any golf clubs, so there's a lot of things that they don't have, which that doesn't bother them in any way, and they raise a big family and they're taken care of. So, you're right, but I still think that, bottom line is you're right, but that's where you have to have the balance of living with faith in God, but also with a sense of responsibility to society. So the second point, the second idea over here is completely different. The second interpretation of the story has almost like zero similarity to the first. And that is, the Maharsha looks at this, and again, you'll see a certain thread about how the Maharsha, who stands for Moreno Harav Rav Shmuel Edels, who lived about 500 years ago, he almost takes all of the stories on a different track. He looks at it more historically, and he says this episode is a snapshot of history. And he says the frog represents the kingdom of Greece, and the sea monster represents the kingdom of Rome, which came and swallowed Greece. The raven represents the kingdom of the Islamic kingdom, which came and swallowed the kingdom of Rome. So he sees this completely differently, and he explains why each one is that animal relates to that entity. And the Islamic kingdom, which overtook Rome or swallowed that power, relies on goes and rests on the tree. What's the tree? The tree is Abraham. He says Abraham is the strength upon which, because we know the Muslims come from Abraham too, right? The Jewish people are descendants of Abraham through Isaac. The Muslims are descendants of Abraham through Ishmael. So that tree, because we find Abraham is compared to the strong tree, is where they derive their strength from, which gives them the ability to have the mighty kingdom they have. So this is how the Maharsha explains that story. Again, I think the first one is more of an explanation which we can relate to today, but that's the second interpretation of this story. All right, let's move on to the next story, which is story number 6 in this sequence of tales of Rabbah Bar Bar Chanah. And again, the way we're going to do it is I'll say the tale, the story, which again is a metaphoric story, and I'll challenge you to share your thoughts on what may be the interpretation, the nimshal, and then I'll share 2 interpretations of the story that the commentaries give. Okay. The Amar Rabbah Bar Bar Chanah. Rabbah Bar Bar Chanah said the following: Zimna Chada, it happened once. Hava ka'azlinam besvinta. We were going on a ship. The chazina nahu kavra. We saw a certain fish. The yasvile achla tina beusye. A small creeping thing. So now he was traveling in a ship. They saw a fish. A small creeping item settled in its nostril of the fish. Umis, and the fish died. Ve'idchuhu maya v'shadyuhu leguda. The water expelled this dead fish and threw it onto the shore. This fish was so enormous, again we see this common theme of enormous animals, was so enormous. V'charav minei shitin mechuzi. 60 cities were destroyed by this fish landing on the sea, on the shore, created also such turmoil. 60 cities were destroyed by it. V'achlu minei shitin mechuzi. 60 cities were sustained by the flesh, or they ate from it. They ate from the fish. Umalchu minei shitin mechuzi. And 60 cities salted the fish and preserved it. So you had 60 cities destroyed from this giant dead fish, 60 which were ate from it, enjoyed it, pleasured on it, and 60 which salted it, preserved it. Umilu michad galgala de'ene klasme agarve mishcha. They're able to fill 300 barrels of oil with one eyeball. Okay. V'chihadron lebasa trese achishata. He says when we returned 12 months later, we saw that they were sewing beams from the bones of this fish, and they were using the bones of the fish to rebuild the 60 cities which were destroyed. That's the story. Giant fish, which was killed by a tiny insect, it landed on the shore. Some cities were destroyed. Some cities ate from it. Some cities preserved it. 12 months later, they were using the bones of the fish to rebuild the destroyed cities. That's story number 6. Does anyone want to take a stab at this? What may possibly be the lesson or the nimshal of this parable story in the Talmud? Yes, go for it.
Go for it. Maybe it's teaching us that God will provide for us even if things don't seem so great.
Okay.
So like the city was destroyed, but they end up using what God provided them to rebuild the city.
Right. Even that which was destroyed was rebuilt.
Yeah, that's my interpretation.
Okay.
All right, if you want to stick with a Torah scholar, maybe some Torah scholar lived in, the world of Torah, and then he had to go to another city, and it drove some people away, and another one, it sustained some that wanted to learn from him, and other ones didn't appreciate him. Then eventually they did appreciate him, and then the people who were drawn away eventually learned to appreciate him, like sewing the bones, even though he was much older, and maybe he couldn't teach as much. I don't exactly know all those details, but then everyone began to appreciate him.
Okay.
If we stick to the Vilna Gaon. So.
All right. Yes.
I'm going to take a stab at it as that the fish is the metaphor of the Jewish people. And the Jewish people were big, powerful, capable in the type of entity, but they did one small error that ended up destroying them and resulted in all kinds of catastrophes. But the Jewish people never really died. They just kind of continue, right? And the different actions conducted on the fish, right, shows of different actions to sort of revitalize the fish and revitalize the negative connotation, the negative side effects of that small avera, and the capability of sustaining, and the capability of rebuilding, and the capability of nurturing, based on the actions of
Right.
conducted.
Beautiful. Okay. All right.
Like we're all wrong.
What is 60? So I'm actually not going to go too much into 60.
180. It's also the air to 180. You got a little high going on there. High 10.
Hurry up, give us the
Okay.
answer.
We wanted the answer.
Let's get into this. I want to share the answer also for Ephraim, and when I read this explanation, it struck me in the context of actually what we just experienced now a little over a week ago, the tragedy that we're still sifting through, so to say, and literally, the tragedy of loss of life in Florida. So this story kind of brought me back to that, and I'll explain why. The explanation I want to share is from the Olalos Ephraim. And he says like this. He says, over here, in general, the idea of the ship sailing is life. Life is like a ship that sails. The ship is not very sturdy. The ship deals with storms. So the ship sailing is, as we see in all these stories, is a metaphor for life. We came across a giant fish. The fish over here, says Olalos Ephraim, is a tzaddik, a holy person. We do find that Rabbi Akiva famously said that a fish in the water is like a Jew immersed in Torah. So a fish, just like a fish, is completely immersed in the water and relies on the water for life. A Jew swims in the sea of Torah is like a fish in the water. And here's where, Eric, you are accurate in this part. And that is that a tzaddik, it says, is held accountable for even the smallest thing. Right? We had the Torah portion a few weeks ago that Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't allowed into Israel. Why not? Because he struck the rock. He did something which was not a sin for most people. Because he's righteous, the holier the person, the more they are held accountable to. I think that is true in life in general, right? When someone is at a very high level of expertise, so then even the tiniest mistake is very significant. The greatest artist will find the tiniest mistake in their art to be significant. The greatest person, the greatest athlete, the tiniest flaw becomes the biggest deal. So for the tzaddik, the fish in the water, that tiniest mistake could spell their doom, which is the tiniest mistake of this little bug which lands in the nostril of the animal that kills the animal. Okay, so this represents the death of a tzaddik, the death of the righteous. So the fish dying is the death of the righteous. The Gemara basically then says there are 3 different ways to respond to death. Paraphrasing a little bit, but what it talks about the 3 different cities is 3 different ways to respond to death. One city, it says, or whatever, 60 cities. The first group of cities is destroyed by it, which means the first class reacts with extreme abstinence. They see that even the righteous die on account of a minor sin, and they therefore decide to live a life of self-denial and abstain from all worldly activities. Their lives are thereby devastated. It's not the way God intended the world. Again, I'm going to change things a little bit for what we're going through in the world today. But basically, a person can respond to death and lose faith in life. And say, what's the point of living? Look, you can't survive. Life is there's too much danger. There's too many worries. There's too many things which could end life. And therefore, they allow the death of the righteous to kill their own life. They separate from living because this is their reaction to death. The reaction to death is that I give up. I give up. I can't live. I believe either fear. There's all sorts of ways in which the response to death is death. That I lose my cheshek, I lose my desire to live, and therefore it kills me, the fact that I see death. That's one response to it. That's the first city. The first group of cities were destroyed by the fish that died. What's the second group? What happened? The second group, it says they see the fish, they eat. It's almost like the exact opposite. And this is, the second group reacts just the opposite way. Seeing that even the righteous perish, they perceive death as the ultimate end of all activity and disregard the afterlife. Therefore they say to themselves, for now, let's eat and drink and make merry, for tomorrow we will die. That's the pasuk in Yeshaya. Death teaches them to indulge in worldly activities. They are the cities that eat from the dead fish. In other words, because death is imminent, so why take life seriously? Why take life seriously? Just enjoy. You know, you never know when it's going to be your last day. Life is not for sure, so just have a party. Turn life into a party. This is the other reaction. You can either respond to death by saying, I give up, like, well, there's too much, I may also die, what's the point of life, why should I bother? And I live in fear, I live in worry. The other way is the exact opposite. To totally throw away responsibility and say, just enjoy life because it's temporary, it's going to be over tomorrow, may as well have a party today. So that's the second group of people, how they respond to death. And then there's the third group. Both of these are inappropriate. The response to death of being fearful and not living and allowing it to kill me is wrong because God wants you to live. The response to death and saying life is just a joke. There's no reality to it. There's no certainty to it. So therefore, just go out and have a party. That's also incorrect. The third group, the third class, adopts a third approach, which is the most sensible and correct of the three. That is, death teaches them that one has to collect as many merits as possible while still alive, so that their reward should be preserved for the next world. They are the cities that salt the dead fish to preserve it for later. The responsible, appropriate response to death, whether it's death of someone righteous or a death of tragedy, is to learn to value life. Not to be afraid of life, not to be afraid to live, and also not to live totally recklessly, but to recognize, yes, life is not for sure. Every day you have is important. Value it, preserve the time you have. The lesson you should learn is how valuable your life is, how valuable your friends are, how valuable your family is, how valuable every mitzvah opportunity is. Don't push it off. Preserve the life that you have. You were going to say something? No. Oh, okay. Anyways, so this is the third approach. These are the three responses to death. And I think this is a very profound explanation, also, Frank. I think this is so poignant. It's so practical because we come across death, and perhaps recently more so than beforehand. And I think you see these three approaches. There's the approach of people who respond to death by being paralyzed by fear. Paralyzed. Why should I bother, living when who knows, a building may collapse, I may catch a virus and die. I mean, there's all sorts of things which could paralyze me. Paralyzing is a form of stopping of life. That's the first city. There's a response that says, I don't care. Who cares? If it's supposed to kill me, it'll kill me. I don't care anymore. That's really reckless. There is a third approach, which is that the response to this fish that dies, the righteous that die, is to preserve life. It's to learn the value of every day of life, the value of mitzvahs, the value of loved ones, all those values, and preserve it and hold on to it. And that's the third city, and that's the ideal way one should respond to tragedy.
So it's not necessarily a tzaddik. It's somebody that is
Right.
close
So
to.
the story in the story, the Olos Ephraim says a fish is compared to a righteous person. But yeah, the concept, I think we're allowed to expand it a little bit, and it expands to any situation where we confront with death, but specifically death which seems to be unjust. That's the idea of a tzaddik. It seems to be unjust. When death is something which is unjust, like what we're experiencing, that's where there's more of a reaction. When someone is, thank God, is 120 years old and lives and dies, okay, so we accept it. That's the way we assumed it would be. It's when something happens which we didn't expect, which kind of shakes us, so we respond to that. That's where we respond with a paradigm shift. So how do we change our behavior? It can be in two negative ways, or it can be one positive way. But I'm actually going to skip the Maharshal's explanation, but let's just say he says this story is about Purim. He says this is the Purim story, so you see it's completely different. He says it has to do with Haman and Mordechai. I'm going to put that aside for a moment because I do want to get to the 7th for the next story. Here's the next story, and I've shared this in the past, so this you may have heard from me because I've shared this out of the context of this time. Back to Rabbah Bar Bar Chanah, and back to another journey that he had. The Amar Rabbah Bar Bar Chanah. Rabbah Bar Bar Chanah said, Zimna Chada, it happened once, Havaka Azlinon Bisvinta. We were traveling in a ship. The Chazinon, this is, by the way, I sent out the text today about the most, what did I say? The most magical, dangerous island. Here we are. This is what we're getting to, right here. He said we were traveling in a ship. The Chazinon Ukavra. We saw a certain island which seemed to be perfect. We were traveling in a ship, and we saw an island, and we thought, beautiful, now we can relax on the island. The Yasvale, we sat there, Ach Latina Ba'usei. I'm sorry, I'm going back to that one. The Yasvale Chalsa Agabe, we had sand on it, so we decided, let's go settle on this island. The Kadach Agme Iluye. It had sand, there was a meadow on it, it looked like dry land. So we decided to go onto this island. Beautiful island. Sabrinon Yaveshtahi, dry land. Visalkinon, we went off, and we went onto the island. V'afinon, we started baking. Ubashlinon, and we started cooking agabe. Cooking and baking on the island.
It's very weird. It says fish in here.
Wait, so we're cooking on the island,
Oh.
just a second.
Oh, sorry.
Wait a second.
Oh.
The Kazam Gabe. Once we were cooking and baking, and it became hot, Ishapech, this island started turning over. Because it turns out it wasn't an island at all, it was a fish. And the fish was not so happy that it was being cooked on and baked on. So it started flipping over. And in fact, it did flip over. And it threw us off of it. And he concludes, the ilav dahava mekarva sfinta, had the boat not been nearby, hava tavinon, we would have drowned. That's the story. We were traveling in a boat. We came across an island. The island looked beautiful. There was meadows. We went onto the island. We started cooking and baking. And then once we had started cooking and baking, the island started turning over. We realized the island wasn't an island but a fish. Threw us into the water. And had the boat not been nearby, we would have drowned. But the boat was nearby, so we were able to climb onto the boat and survive. That's the story. Would anyone like to share their thoughts on this story as to what it may possibly mean?
Got another idea.
All right.
You gave us a cheat clue too.
How
With
so?
the previous fish, because the fish is obviously, I'm going to take a guess here, the fish is still a representation of a sock.
It is not. Not in this one.
All right, then my theory's off.
No, this one's different. Because because I'm going with a different commentary on this one.
All right.
I'm giving the commentary of the Maharsha on this one. Different than the previous one. Because this is one which, yeah.
Maybe
Now, if you recall, the Maharsha has a historical approach to these Gemaras. Yes.
this word is a word of sheker, word of lie.
Yeah.
And basically, this island represents this word, and like it can flip, it can show itself very easy. And this boat that was closed is
Right. Is
like,
what? Is Olam Haba.
yeah,
Okay.
or Hashem or Torah. Or,
Okay.
Okay, I have one.
Go for it.
So the island, so where the people on the boat supposed to be the Jewish people
Okay.
going to a foreign land,
Mm-hmm.
and they think that it's very comfortable and they're cooking and it's a very comfortable place to live, and then the land flips on them and goes against them, and had they not had the Torah and the values, they wouldn't have survived.
Wow.
Is this the name of the art sculpture right there?
I didn't read it.
There's an island with
see it.
mysterious island
Good one, man.
Egypt.
What's that?
The island Egypt. It's
Okay.
basically-
All right.
Or if it's a Maharsha, Persia. If that's the case, then it's probably.
All right. Yes.
maybe
I think it's fair to
Yes.
say that Ellie hit the nail on the head. But I'm going to elaborate a little bit, but he basically said the essence of the idea, and I think it is literally one of the most profound metaphors in all the Talmud, and I'll explain why. The Maharsha says he associates, again, like the last story, he associates this story with Purim. Why? If you may have heard this before, that Adar, the mazel of Adar, the mazel for the month of Adar is dagim, is fish. Fish is the mazel for the month of Adar. What is in English? Pisces. What is the fish? Yeah. So the mazel of the month of Adar is fish. So he says anytime we come across this fish thing, it has to do with the Purim story. What is the Purim story? What began? So we're familiar with Haman wanting to destroy the Jewish people, and Esther coming to save the Jewish people along with Mordechai. But wait a second. If you look in the Haggadah, the story doesn't begin with Haman. The story doesn't begin with Esther. The story doesn't begin with Mordechai. What does it begin with? Achashverosh. And what happens? There's this big feast. Why is that even necessary in the story? Why does the story of the Megillah mention the feast? Theoretically, the whole first chapter of the Megillah, I know we're about 6 months away from Purim, both sides, but the whole first chapter of the Purim story seems to be totally irrelevant. It could start with chapter 2. Achashverosh was looking for a wife, and he chose Esther, and then he chose Haman. You could start from chapter 2, and you'd have the whole Purim story. You would seem to think you'd have the whole essence of the Purim story. Yet it doesn't. It starts with a very elaborate description of this party that Achashverosh threw. So the Talmud addresses it and says the reason why it describes this party is because the Jews were participants in the party, and they shouldn't have been. They should not have gone to that event. And yet Jews partook in this great feast that Achashverosh threw, and it was more than just going to a feast. This is about 70 years after the destruction of the temple. Jewish people were downtrodden for 70 years. It's a long time. And suddenly you have a king who says, I'm inviting you to my party. You get to join the ranks of my people. And the Jews jump at that opportunity.
he celebrated the.
And he was
idea
celebrating
that
the destruction of the temple, taking out the vessels, right?
And he wore
the clothing of the Kohen Gadol. The Jews shouldn't have been there. Why did they go there? They went there because it was a way of saying a statement. It was their statement saying, we trust that Achashverosh, by inviting us, he shows that we are equal citizens, and therefore we are placing our trust in Achashverosh. Achashverosh will take care of us. And that was the beginning of the downfall of the Jewish people. The downfall doesn't start with Haman. Haman is the result of the Jewish people relinquishing their faith in God and placing their faith in Achashverosh. Instead of the mindset of in God we trust, they said in Achashverosh we trust. Says the Maharsha, this is the story going on here. He says the Jewish people, we were traveling on a boat. Says the Maharsha, traveling on a boat is the story of the Jewish history. Jewish history, we're always traveling. Jews are moving. We've been on the move for thousands of years. If we look around the room over here, you know, there's 10, 15 of us here, we all come from different places. Different places, whether it's Poland or Russia or the Middle East or wherever we come from. Why? Because Jews are traveling. And wherever we travel, we find ourselves on this boat, which is not very secure, not very sturdy. That's the idea of a boat. A boat is not as secure as dry land. I think I mentioned this, but the Maharsha brings this down. He says sailors are holy. Why are sailors holy? The Talmud also says sailors are holy. Why are sailors holy? Because they're always praying. Because that's what happens is they're in the water, constantly praying. So the boat of Jewish history, the boat of Jewish identity is not very secure. We've been constantly under threat. There's constantly those who want to destroy us. So we travel in this boat, and time and again we feel like, why do we have to stay in this boat, which is insecure? And we come to an island, and we come to a country which seems to welcome us in and say, you can get off that rickety boat and comfortably settle on dry land. You don't have to hold on to your Jewish identity. Your Jewish identity is insecure. Your Jewish identity will always bring you problems. May as well settle into the dry land we're offering you, in this case, Achashverosh, and settle in. And over here you'll be comfortable. And we are, the Jewish people, time and again, are lured into that. Whether it's with Achashverosh, whether it's with the Jews in Spain, there was a golden era in Spain in which the Jews immersed themselves in Spanish, became Spaniards, whether it was Jews of Poland, where you had this feeling that Poland was the golden Medina, before that America was called the golden Medina, Poland was called the golden Medina, whether it was Germany, where Jews felt very comfortable in the Enlightenment of Germany, like there was a line that German Jews were more German than the Germans, whether in every country we went to, whether it was the Middle East, different countries there, we settled in and we felt we are at home now. We no longer need our Jewish identity, because look, we have been embraced. Let's hop onto this island. And once we settle in, and then we start cooking, we get too comfortable there, suddenly that island, which seems so secure, begins to turn. And suddenly we realize we were never really fully welcome here. And they throw us back in the water. And the good news is that time and again, the boat was there. That rickety boat of Judaism, somehow we managed to reconnect to our identity. When we realized that this island was not so secure, the boat of our Torah, the boat of our mitzvah, the boat of our connection to the Jewish people was waiting for us. It didn't sail. Even as we stepped foot off, we went out to the island. It didn't sail away from us. That boat of our identity remained there.
Did they rush to the island? Was there any inference that they were like, oh my goodness,
Right.
yeah, wow,
It does
great
say
land,
It says, look, there's a meadow, there's beauty, there's
let's run to it.
And this is the story of history. And if I may say, it's easy to look at Jews in past eras and say, this applies to them, this applies to them. It applies to us. It applies to us in a sense that, various countries, certainly in America, we can make the same mistake. I'm not suggesting that there's some sort of sinister objective of America that they want, that there's a plan to destroy the Jewish people. It's not what I'm suggesting. What I'm saying is that a Jew should never place their trust in the country they're in. Our trust remains in God. In other words, using this metaphor, we should always keep one foot on the boat and perhaps one foot on the island. If you want to step, keep one foot on the boat. I think here in America we should be thankful for the blessings we have, and thankful for the freedoms we have, and thankful for the government that protects us. I really do. I believe that never in history have we had such freedoms. And therefore, a person should be thankful and appreciative and to what this country, the values this country stands on. But not to cross that line in which we say, in my country I trust. A Jew has to say, I remain firmly in that boat. My identity is that rickety boat, is the Jewish identity, which has been attacked and continues to be attacked. I mean, look, I'm speaking a few hours after a colleague of mine, a Chabad rabbi in Boston, was attacked on the footsteps of his Chabad house. So till today we have these issues. Thankfully he's recovering in the hospital, but the point is that we have, on the one hand, there is the appreciation and the gratitude for the freedoms we have, but on the other hand, let's not make the mistake of the Purim story, and the mistake throughout history in which we said, I don't need my Jewish identity anymore, because now I found a new identity, and this new identity is really secure. Yeah.
So, one question then, if you don't have the answer, it's fine. What's Israel? Because Israel is not the rickety boat. It is, well, sort of a foundation, right? But it's not the fish, right? It's not going to turn.
That's a great question.
You know, so
Ideally, Israel is not just a land for Jews, but is a Torah land. In other words, Israel is. What is Israel? If you look at Israel, according to Torah, Israel is not just a. God says, well, there's millions of Jews. They need a land. All right, here's a land for you. No, Israel has a divinity to it. The entire land is saturated with holiness. There are mitzvahs connected to the land. It's almost like mitzvah. Israel is that boat, but in a sturdy way. Israel is a place where we say it's a lifestyle which is completely focused on in God we trust. The idea of all the obligations of charity and turning to God and going to the temple 3 times a year. It's a land in which, when following its proper laws, was a land which constantly refocused its inhabitants on having trust in God's sustenance. So it's not just about a land technically which was designated to Jewish people. It's a land which was saturated with the mindset of bitachon, of faith and trust in Hashem.
So it's a cruise ship.
So yeah,
it's not the rickety
exactly,
ship.
the cruise ship, right?
Okay.
So that's the idea.
It's not. I think it's still the same. If you talk about Israel or America, with that approach, eventually Israel doesn't replace the Torah, or the government of Israel doesn't replace the Torah.
If a person gets too look, if a person in Israel until today Baruch Hashem, Eretz Yisrael exists. A person says the reason Israel is going to survive is because we have the IDF. That's making the same mistake. Yes, thank God for the IDF, thank God. But it's if we say, well, because we kochi v'otzim yadi. The Torah talks about this directly, where a person says kochi v'otzim yadi asali l'sachai alazeh. That it's my strength and my abilities and my brain power which is going to make sure that we survive and we're going to thrive, then that's making this mistake in a slightly different form, but it's the same underlying mistake.
I think that the difference is from last week parasha that Bilam said that Am levado yishkon ve'bagoim lo yitchashav. Jewish people. So that should be the difference between Israel and America or other countries.
Right.
Because
A nation that dwells alone, and not vagoim lo yischav. All right, we're gonna finish it up over here. We'll bring out some refreshments, and then we'll. As soon as we can, we'll do a quick minion for Myra.
finish.
So I do want to mention a special mazel tov to 2 of the participants in the